to the God Conclusion. I'm your host, John Leonard. Greetings, listeners. Welcome to another episode of the God Conclusion. Today, I want to do a recap of the first 12 episodes to give us a bearing on where we are and where we're going. To start out, I want to quote Buddha. Even though I'm a Christian, I believe that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, but I'm going to quote Gautama Siddhartha, the first Buddha, who said, "Believe nothing, no matter where you read it or who said it, even if I said it, unless it agrees with your own reason and your own common sense." Those are words I quote from my book. I recommend people look at the sources that I am claiming to take the quotes from and verifying that they are where I said they are and they said what I claimed they said. When I started this Facebook page for the God Conclusion, I had no idea or no intention of starting a podcast. But one thing led to another, and this gentleman who goes by the name of Aaron Ra, his real last name or his birth last name was Nelson, but he did legally change it. And I can only presume that he wants to set this impression in the minds of people that he's godlike. I knew who he was, I knew him by reputation. He's maybe not famous in worldwide circles, but in the world of atheism, he's a big shot. And so I took the challenge to debate him, or whatever you want to call what the exchange that we had was. And I did some research before I spoke with him. And I watched some of his videos and I made note of some of the claims he made. And when I challenged him on the video, it was an amazing experience. Don't take my word for it. Certainly don't take his word for it. Look at the facts. Do your own research and find out. Some of the claims that he made, one that was most notable was that Adolf Hitler was a Christian and a creationist. Now, the Christian claim I can understand making because Hitler was baptized as a Christian when he was a child. But as an adult, it's very difficult for me to say that Hitler acted as a Christian would act, or a Christian should act, is what I should say. But this claim that Hitler was a creationist is laughable, in my opinion. And I cited the research of this professor who's written a number of books about Hitler and his views on Darwinian evolution. And Hitler's Ministry of Education taught Darwinian evolution. It did not teach creationism. So to say anything other than that is false. Now, I don't like calling people liars. I prefer to give them the benefit of the doubt and to think that it's an honest mistake rather than a deliberate misstatement or fabrication. But to say that Hitler was a creationist is a bit of a joke. And then we also got into an extended argument on whether or not the Big Bang, which is scientific evidence or a scientific theory, I should say, about the origin of the universe. And he was arguing that the universe did not have an origin. And that is flatly contradicted by all the scientific literature that I've read. And I kind of know or think I know what the point he was trying to make was. And that is that the math gets wonky as you approach the time of t called known as t equals zero, where the that's where the Big Bang began, is t equals zero. And as you approach that point, the math no longer works nicely. So there, scientists say that they aren't sure. They are sure that there was a point in time where there were no stars, there were no galaxies, were no planets, but they aren't sure what existed and how long what existed prior to the universe coming into existence. It's a semantic argument. The point is, there once upon a time there was this theory called the steady state universe theory, which held that the universe has always existed in its current state. And that theory was completely debunked by the evidence for the Big Bang Theory. Whether or not you want to argue that the Big Bang was the true origin of the universe or whatever, the universe had an origin. It's not really arguable based on scientific evidence. So I don't really understand his point in saying that he was going to call Sean Carroll or call Lawrence Krauss because he knows these guys and he knows that they're atheists and they would try to support him as much as possible. But I quote Sean Carroll in my book talking about the Big Bang. So to say that Sean Carroll would say that the Big Bang never happened, I I would be shocked. But at any rate, because if I were party to that call, I would look up where I quoted Sean Carroll in interviews and televised speeches and things of that nature, where he has made claims that I then quoted directly in my book. So again, I don't really understand, except for nothing that I said could Aaron agree to, seemed to be the bottom line. So after we recorded that interview, which very interestingly, Aaron did a live stream of the interview, but he did not offer me a copy of the recording that he made, and he did not publish the recording that he made. It's still to this day, I'm not able to find it on his YouTube channel. The only place that you can find it is on my channel, which is the reason I started the channel, was so that it couldn't just get swept under the rug. But after, or I should say, while I was speaking with Aaron, this fellow named Jacek Kolodziejczak, who is a listener, he's a big fan of Aaron Ra. He's a guy in Poland, an IT professional, which I thought was interesting given that we shared that in common. And he really wanted to speak with me after I spoke with Aaron Ra because, as he put it, Aaron really gave me a raw deal and he wanted me to have a more pleasant experience talking with a more reasonable atheist and yada yada. I didn't mind talking to him. I had pretty much by this time decided to start the podcast. And so I recorded our phone call. And what I want to say is that Jacek and I were supposed to discuss theism versus and creationism versus evolution theory. And that was the primary purpose of the conversation. And we didn't talk about it at all. Before we got started, and I should say, I want to accept full responsibility for the fact that the interview or the phone conversation got off track and never got on track, even though we talked for nearly 2 hours. But he started talking about having an epistemic duty to pursue the truth, and I agreed with that. And tried to begin by explaining how I came to the beliefs that I have, how I came to hold the beliefs that I have. And in doing so, I mentioned my belief in ghosts and NDEs, and that got us off onto an extended tangent. And then we spent a good bit of time talking about the scientific method, and finally, for some strange reason, or actually I can explain it, but it'd take a long time, we got off onto another tangent on why atomic theory is not faith. And I don't want to say that it's because English is not his native tongue. But I accept full responsibility for the fact that the conversation did not go as planned. We had a very long talk, and I explained to him in some detail my faith experience, because that to me is very important to how I came to hold my other beliefs. Was I first came to have faith in God, and then I was confronted by Richard Dawkins and the God delusion, excuse me, and had to reconcile science with my beliefs. So that took me on a journey that's gone on for quite a number of years. And Jacek really wanted to have a second conversation recorded so that he could tell the people that listen to me or interested in my book, my quote unquote audience, such as it exists, that he doesn't believe anything I said. And he thinks I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he does not believe anything I said. And I had told him how I came to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the true Messiah. And I mentioned two Bible verses and opening your heart to the experience. And when he came back and tried to talk about it, he spoke of conducting an experiment. And that's not what I did. That's not what I would recommend. You don't put God to the test. It's in the Bible. So we weren't ever going to see eye to eye. And I did not need to have him on a second conversation just so that he could tell you what I've already told you, which is he doesn't believe anything I said. And he has free will. Anybody can reject what I say. And that's why I say, don't believe what I say, test it, check my sources, watch the interviews that I've watched, watch the videos that I've watched, and see if you come to the same conclusion that I have. But the next person that I spoke with was actually the very first interview. I spoke to him before I spoke with Jacek, and it was my friend Kyle Lloyd. And Kyle has been a personal friend on social media for a very long time. He is also a conservative, and I try not to get into politics, but conservatism does conform with my religious beliefs. And so I am a conservative. I don't want to do politics on the Facebook page. But Kyle came to the Facebook page and didn't know that I was the author of the book. And he started making some comments. One thing led to another. We got into an extended, kind of heated debate about evolution theory. he invited Aaron Ra onto the Facebook page because he saw Aaron as a greater expert than himself. And so that led to my conversation with Aaron. And so then after speaking with Aaron, I wanted to have Kyle on as one of the first podcasts. As I was learning the ropes of how to do recordings and edit recordings and things of that nature, I needed practice. And so Kyle was good practice. We talked about evolution. And like I said, Kyle's a young guy and he's basically a good guy. You wouldn't have known it by what he was posting when he first came to the Facebook page. But we agree on more than we disagree. And what we don't agree on, I'm not convinced that he's a lost cause. I'll just leave it at that. Now, the next few interviews, and I'm kind of going through all of the what I would call adversarial conversations first, and then I'll talk about the other conversations that I've had. But I spoke with a guy named Kent Schofield, who is a former Christian, and we were discussing the planned versus the unplanned universe, which is a central theme of my book, The God Conclusion. And there was some miscommunication because he read the chapter that I would call my chapter on existential scientific evidence. And he was calling that my chapter for intelligent design. And I had a second chapter in the book specifically titled Intelligent Design Argument. So there was some confusion during our conversation as to whether we were both talking about the same thing. But again, I understood my book well enough to talk about the content in chapter 11, but we were calling it the intelligent design argument, and we didn't get to the intelligent design argument. When I think of intelligent design, I'm thinking of things like Fibonacci spirals and Mandelbrot fractals and trophic cascades and things of that nature. I'm not thinking octopus. I mean, where in the evolutionary chain does an octopus fit? I have read or seen some scientists who were quote unquote supposed to be serious people who speculated that octopus were actually extraterrestrial creatures that originated on another planet because they are so unlike any other animals here on Earth. But I don't have that source right at my disposal where I can pull up the video and show you what that guy was saying. And I'll just have to leave it there for now. But Kent and I, we talked a bit about the planned versus unplanned universe, and we talked a bit about intelligent design, but we didn't have the argument for intelligent design that I would have presented or I expected to discuss. But, that's kind of a minor point. I understood where he's coming from. And here's my approach. I'm wanting to have conversations where I try to understand where the other person's coming from, but I don't look at this as an opportunity to proselytize for my faith. It's a conversation. I'm not trying to make people uncomfortable. I'm not trying to beat them over the head. I had some other conversations that I'll get to in a minute that I was as friendly and sympathetic to the person I was interviewing as I could be, but I don't know if the questions I was asking in the interview really reflect my true feelings on the subject. But again, that's kind of jumping ahead. Another adversarial conversation that I had was with this guy named Lars Cade, who is another former Christian, which I kind of assume that if you're an atheist, the I'm a former Christian is a foregone conclusion. I mean, you could be a former Jewish person or a former Muslim, but the odds are if you're talking with me, former Christian is going to be the label that most accurately applies to you. But Lars was a former Christian, and Lars had an interesting challenge. He took the text of First Corinthians 13, which just so happens to have been one of the scripture chapters that my wife and I used in our wedding ceremony many years ago. But he contrasted First Corinthians 13 and Paul's famous talk about all the attributes of love and contrasted those with Old Testament passages that were cherry picked to make God look as bad as he possibly could. Because again, this is a former Christian, so he's got a hostile view of Christianity, but he's presenting this as pleasantly as possible in a non confrontational manner as possible to match the tone that the podcast is trying to set. And I appreciated that. I did not agree with the cherry picking, and I didn't try to cover all the verses that he had included in his document. I mean, I addressed them in writing, but we didn't speak about them all in the course of the conversation because I just needed a few examples to show why taking the Bible out of context isn't the right way to read it. What I strongly recommend is if you ever read something in the Bible that you don't understand, take a step back and study it. Don't just read it. Don't just read the verse that's giving you a problem. Read the whole chapter. Read the chapter before the chapter that's giving you the problem. And that was the secret of my coming to a new, like a eureka moment in the story of Abraham and Isaac. And I've written about this. I think I included it in the book, but I've got an article that I published on the website years ago where I talked about when I was a Christian after coming to true faith, there was still a time where there were passages in the Bible that really bothered me, and I avoided reading them. I avoided thinking about them. Probably the easiest, most famous example is Genesis 22, the story of Abraham and Isaac, where, contrary to everything we know about Yahweh, he orders Abraham to offer his son Isaac as a human sacrifice. And it's so antithetical, so contrary to the God of the New Testament and Jesus that, I mean, it's one of those verses that I once got thrown out of a Bible study for saying that the God of the New Testament and the God of the Old Testament almost seemed like there were two different gods because the God of the Old Testament is fire and brimstone and wrath and judgment. And the God of the New Testament is love and compassion and forgiveness. And that those two gods did not seem to reconcile. But again, it was my shallow understanding of the Bible rather than two different gods being described. Genesis 22 only makes sense if you read the second half of Genesis 21. This is in my opinion, and I am not simply reading the scripture verses. I am interpreting those verses so that they make logical sense to me. And the way Genesis 22 and the sacrifice story begins to make sense is if you look at Genesis 21 and this seemingly innocuous story about Abimelech and a treaty negotiation for the ownership of this well in the desert that's now known as Abraham's well, even to this day. That story has to be there for a reason. The Bible doesn't include superfluous details. a single generation in the Bible is often summarized in a single sentence. So for this story about a well to go on for half of a chapter in Genesis, there's got to be more to it than that. And what I took from it was that Abraham was not being truthful. That when he was talking to Abimelech, he was basically stealing the well. And he paid him, but he paid him a nominal price of, I think, 7 lambs or something of that nature. But there's not a good explanation for why God would offer or order Abraham to offer Isaac as a human sacrifice, knowing that he detests human sacrifice when other gods ask for it. So Lars and I did not get into the scripture that I find the most problematic. That came when I spoke with a guy named Timon Robbins. And Timon was a very interesting guy. He's based in the UK, and he's been involved in this charity called Bethel UK for, I think, 16 or 17 years, he said. And he originally came to that charity as a heroin addict. And after he was cured of his addiction, in part through scripture based, I'm sorry, my phone's sending me texts. I need to read that one, but not right this minute while I'm recording this video. Timon, he spoke about his work as a fundraiser and an organizer for the Bethel UK charity. But probably for me, the most interesting part of our conversation was when we spoke about a sermon that he gave a few years back on the story of Jephthah from, I think it's Second Kings. And if you think Abraham and Isaac bothered me, Jephthah bothered me even worse, because to me, the literal interpretation of the story is Jephthah promises to offer as a sacrifice the first creature that walks out of his house when he returns home. And when he gets home, that creature is his daughter. And he sends her off to mourn her virginity and or something of that nature, which Timon said meant that because Yahweh does not ever allow for human sacrifice, Jephthah could not have offered his daughter as a human sacrifice. There had to be some alternative. So she was a permanent virgin because of this commitment from Jephthah. And that has a great deal of appeal, but there's a danger of falling prey to what I call wishful thinking, where you're reading into scripture something that there isn't there. But guess what? I just did that in the story of Abraham and Isaac. So how can I criticize Timon for coming to a similar conclusion in his account of Jephthah? It was an interesting conversation, to be sure. There's one more guy, and I'm not going to say that he falls into the category of adversarial conversations, and Timon certainly wasn't. But I will mention briefly, I also spoke with Richard Suttles, who calls himself the faithiest atheist, and I just like the guy. I first noticed his posts on Facebook. He said a lot of things that amused me. I like to laugh. And so we just spoke about his ministry. And actually, even though I'm recording this today, I've already recorded a second conversation with Richard where we talk about morality. So that's coming soon. That's probably actually the next conversation that'll air. But he's a very interesting guy, fun to talk with. And I'm even thinking about making him a more permanent or more regular contributor to this podcast. I don't know how that would work because it's already hard enough to get two people to come on and talk, and three just would add to the complexity of it. But it's something that I've thought about and wouldn't mind speaking to him about it. All right. So then, after Time and Richard, there was another Richard Wayne Garganta, and he and I spoke about Christianity and gay marriage. And it's a very interesting conversation because it's coming from the perspective of two people that both want to be sympathetic toward people of that who identify as gay, or I guess is the easiest way to put it. And Richard is not gay himself. He has friends who are gay, just like I do. I have actually family members who are gay. So it's not something that's a completely foreign idea for me. But Richard was arguing in the conversation that that being homosexual, being gay, isn't a choice. And I recalled interviewing somebody when I was the Atlanta Creationism Examiner, where this person was a lesbian and said that she was had been a lesbian her whole life, even though she had been married at one point and had children, her own biological children. But she said that she had always felt that way. And it was around the same time that Lady Gaga had come out with her song Born This Way. And I like to give people the benefit of the doubt. So I wanted to allow the possibility that, I mean, I know that my preference isn't really a choice for me. I'm very strongly heterosexual. I can look at an actor or somebody like that and say that's a handsome man and feel no sexual attraction for that person, if that makes any sense. But so yeah, what I'm saying is, for me, being heterosexual isn't a choice. And if I want to give people the benefit of the doubt, I shouldn't assume that homosexuality should be a choice either. Or that was the direction that Richard had me leaning during our conversation. But then, as is often the case, about 5 minutes after the interview ended, I thought of my best question to ask him, which was, if sexuality isn't a choice, then what explains bisexuals? Because kind of a derogatory term, but I used to call them when I was younger. I'd say that bisexual people were switch hitters. They bat from both sides of the plate, in a manner of speaking. And so the bottom line is, I don't have all the answers, and I don't even ask all the right questions when the conversation's being conducted. They often pop in my head about 5 to 10 minutes after the conversation has ended, which isn't ideal. I need to get a little sharper than that. I had a few more conversations that I thought were very interesting, but I feel like the most interesting conversations, the most lively conversations are the adversarial ones by and large. But I spoke with my friend Max Sternberg, and we spoke about his conversion from Judaism and his science fiction Christian themed novels in his youth ministry. And that was a very pleasant conversation. I spoke with my friend Jim Nettles, And that was an important conversation because Jim had been referred to in my book in a significant manner, but I didn't identify him or by name and only referred to him as this friend in speaking about my ghost experiences. But Jim is the friend where I had all these experiences take place. And if Yasik had been able to hear my conversation with Jim, a lot of his concerns may or may not have been addressed. Because again, I don't think that it was possible to persuade people like Yasik or Lars. I mean, you can present information, but they're not going to change their minds immediately. If they ever change their minds, it's going to take time. And Yasik had made a point at one time that my ghost experiences could have been a sleight of hand type situation where my friend, as then unnamed friend, could have been very talented, like Penn and Teller, and just very good at sleight of hand and played the trick on me. And the problem with that is the stories of the paranormal activity in my friend's house predated his birth. So you can't really say that he was doing these actions that did not seem to be associated with a human person, but he was a witness. And so that made me ask the question, if I claim to have a paranormal experience of some sort, I claim to see a ghost, I understand that is an anecdote. But if a second person witnesses the same event and reaches a similar conclusion, is that still an anecdote? Or could that be considered some sort of evidence collected by the scientific method? I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know that it's important, but I just thought I'd ask it. But Jim was on the program to talk about our long friendship and his life experiences and growing up in a haunted house. And that was one of my favorite conversations. My other favorite conversation in the first 12 episodes was when I spoke with my friend Matthew Botsford. And Matthew is, I mean, I in the book, I talk about the near death experience, and I'm interested in a subset of the near death experience where the person having the experience, the victim, whatever you want to call them, is able to recall specific information that they learned while they were in their mind was disabled or they were temporarily dead or what have you. But while in that state where they shouldn't have been able to learn anything, they learned new information that they were subsequently able to recall. And then that information could be independently corroborated. It's called corroborated veridical NDE perceptions or experiences. And that is probably the subset of NDEs that I find most interesting. The other subset of NDEs that I find interesting are the ones that are counterintuitive to the usual narrative, where somebody claims the normal narrative is you die, you go down this tunnel, you have a life review, you go and you're in paradise and God, and you just dead relatives. And it's generally described as a pleasant experience. And it's interesting that even though the experience itself can't be quantified or documented adequately to satisfy a non believer. What can be adequately documented and verified is the effect having a near death experience has on the people that experience them. They lead more fulfilled lives. They volunteer more in charities. They volunteer in hospice to help other people transitioning from life to death because they have knowledge or they think they have knowledge. And even if you didn't believe that their experience was real, if you're a non believer and you're speaking to somebody like this, why would you want to take that away from them, to make them diminish their belief that their experience was real and second guess themselves? I don't see the purpose of that or what could be gained that's good. But Matthew Botsford did not have the pleasant near death experience. Matthew was shot in the back of the head by an Uzi, kind of a gangbanger situation. He's standing on the streets of Atlanta waiting to catch a cab to his hotel, and a bullet hits him in the back of the head, and he is legally, medically dead before he hits the pavement. And as his brother described it, it was just like somebody pouring a glass of water out on the concrete. His hands never even left his pockets. And he was so far gone that the doctors tried their best to convince his wife to donate his organs, and she wouldn't do it. She had a conversion experience there in the hospital. Neither one of them were Christians. And she had a conversion experience, and she said, God, if you give me back my husband, even if he's in a wheelchair, no matter what, I'm going to stick with him. And to me, that's the same commitment that Ruth made in the Bible. She made the promise of Ruth, and God honors that kind of a commitment. And she got her husband back. I mean, he's not 100%. He'll never be 100%. He'll always have a bullet in his brain, but he's able to walk, he's able to talk, he's able to function so that when you're looking at him in our interview, I don't know that you can tell that he's permanently disabled from his injuries or as I know that when I saw him on a television program, I didn't believe him. I had a doubting Thomas moment where I had to see for myself with my own eyes his injuries. And now I believe him. But what made his story so interesting was he was the quintessential innocent bystander, minding his own business, shot, drops dead, and he claims that instead of going to heaven, he went to hell. And again, you don't have to believe him, but you have to ask yourself, why would somebody lie about something like that? What's his motive? And I know you say, well, he wrote a book. I'm sorry. There's no amount of money that can make losing the permanent use of your left hand when you were left handed. Think about that. He was left handed. He's lost permanent use of his left arm. And so basically, he types and does everything with his non dominant hand, his right hand. He's had to learn how to walk and talk again. I mean, the ordeal that this guy went through, he didn't write a bestseller. His book sold some copies. I don't know how many. The new book that his wife has written is a much better, well, I wouldn't say better. It's a more positive and uplifting book than the first effort that was published by Tate Publishing. And I don't know how much money you can make from books that are published with companies like Tate. But again, that's off on an aside. But Matthew, to me, is just a remarkable person to say I know him personally. I feel honored to know him because somebody tried to kill him. Wasn't specifically trying to kill him, but somebody shot him and killed his friend that was there standing there next to him and left him permanently disabled. And Matthew forgives him. And that to me is expressing the love of Christ. And so those were the first 12 episodes. Thank you for listening. Stay with me. If you have any suggestions for future guests or you want to appear yourself, leave me a comment. Tell me what we'd be talking about. Still got a lot of things left to chat about. And I don't know that, there's always new conversations that are cropping up that I wasn't even anticipating. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to The God Conclusion. If you like this episode, please consider subscribing to this channel. Join us again next week as we continue to seek truth. Quid est veritas.